May 8, 1945. The day the war officially ended in Europe. A date etched into history books with the ink of surrender signatures and victory parades, yet remembered just as vividly in places far less glorious. In the muddy courtyards of prisoner camps, behind barbed wire, where the war's human debris was gathered, counted, and contained. The streets of Berlin still smoldered with ash, women scoured the ruins for potato peels, and children bartered buttons for bread. Yet, in the strangest of turns, behind guarded fences in the custody of the very enemy they had been taught to hate, some German women found their first taste of safety, food, and dignity in years. It was a contradiction too jarring to be ignored. Captivity was kinder than freedom. The women came in different ways. Some were captured while following retreating units, pressed into service as nurses or auxiliaries. Others simply wandered too close to American patrols. A few walked into the camps on their own, desperate for shelter. Their names flickered across rosters and Red Cross reports, each one carrying stories of hunger, bombings, and the quiet terror of nights when walls shook and skies burned red. What waited for them was not the cruelty they had been warned of, but something that looked suspiciously like care. Take Anna, for instance, a 20-year-old from Cologne. She had been raised on warnings that Americans were monsters, savages who would use women as trophies and discard them like rags. But when she was processed into a U.S. camp near Kassel, the first thing placed into her trembling hands was a steaming tin of coffee and 2 thick slices of white bread spread with butter. She stared at the food, unable to believe it wasn't a trick. Later, in her diary, she wrote of the shock of tasting coffee that wasn't made from roasted acorns. She drank until her hands stopped shaking. Outside those fences, life was another matter entirely. In Berlin, women pulled bricks from ruins with bleeding hands, searching for anything edible. In Hamburg, a loaf of bread cost more than a family's savings, when it could be found at all. The average civilian survived on roughly 1,200 calories a day, rationed potatoes, thin soup, sometimes sawdust bread. Yet U.S. military policy, following the Geneva Convention of 1929, mandated humane treatment of prisoners. That meant 3,000 calories a day, with meat, bread, vegetables, and even cigarettes. The numbers told the story in cold ink, but in the mouth it tasted like paradise. Liesel, another prisoner, remembered her first American meal as vividly as the night her home was bombed. It was stew, she recalled, with beef and beans. I had forgotten the taste of meat. I wept when I ate. For women like her, the humiliation of captivity was dulled by the sensation of a full stomach, of sleep without fear that the roof would cave in. The irony was bitter, and yet it was undeniable. The guards, too, played their part in deepening the strangeness of this new reality. Many were young Americans from farms and towns who had seen enough of war to welcome a calmer duty. To them, the women were not the fanatical images painted in propaganda posters, but exhausted figures with hollow cheeks and wary eyes. There were rules, of course. Discipline was expected, boundaries clear, but small acts of kindness slipped through the cracks. An extra biscuit slid across a table. A smile exchanged at roll call. A record player brought out on a Sunday. Such gestures seeded a bewildering thought. Perhaps the enemy was not a monster after all. This contrast between expectation and reality was not lost on the women. 4 years, their world had been an escalating descent. Air raids, ration cuts, the loss of fathers, brothers, and sons. To step suddenly into a camp where food was regular, bedding dry, and violence absent, was almost disorienting. The barbed wire, meant to imprison, began to feel like protection from the chaos outside. One diarist even confessed, "I feared release more than capture." Of course, not every camp was without hardship. There was overcrowding, cold winters, the occasional cruelty of a guard who carried his bitterness too openly. But compared to the rubble and lawlessness waiting beyond, the balance tipped undeniably. American camps became, perversely, a refuge. By late summer of 1945, as the reality of defeat settled like dust over the Reich, stories began to circulate among women outside the camps. Some were rumors exaggerated beyond truth, claims that prisoners had chocolate, that they danced to jazz records, that they had mattresses stuffed with feathers. Others were not far from the mark. Red Cross inspections confirmed the surprising quality of life in U.S.-run facilities, noting compliance with international standards that far exceeded what German civilians endured daily. This knowledge created a strange tension. Women scraping by in ruined cities sometimes envied those behind the fences. Letters smuggled from prisoners spoke of food and safety, sparking disbelief. "You are lucky," one sister wrote bitterly to her captured sibling, "for your prison is kinder than my home." The shame of such comparisons ran deep, but the truth was harder still. In 1945, America's enemies often ate better than its supposed allies. Anna and Liesel, like many others, carried these contradictions in their bones. They knew their freedom had been reduced to the length of a guard's rifle, yet for the first time in years, they felt something close to security. At night, lying in bunks beneath thin blankets, they listened to the murmur of English words around them and wondered what sort of future lay ahead. Release would mean returning to a broken world. Captivity offered order and sustenance. Which was prison, and which was freedom? Even American officers found themselves remarking on the odd balance. Reports noted the low rate of escape attempts, astonishingly low for prisoners of war. Why risk running, when outside the wire was only hunger? One officer, half amused and half unsettled, wrote, "Our problem is not preventing flight, but convincing them they should one day leave." It was, in every sense, a paradox born of war. The women, once told that surrender meant humiliation, now found themselves nourished by the very hands they had been taught to hate. Their captors, sworn enemies, treated them with more civility than fate had granted them in their own homes. In this inversion of expectation, the ground shifted beneath old certainties. The enemy had given them back their humanity. But the story was only beginning. For behind those fences, where hunger eased and fear dimmed, something else began to take root. Relationships formed, languages were exchanged, bonds were tested. And for many women, the strangest realization of all awaited them, not just that prison could be safer than freedom, but that it could reshape their hearts in ways they had never imagined. The gates would not stay closed forever. The world outside still waited, grim and scarred. But for now, in 1945, behind barbed wire, German women discovered a truth that would haunt them long after release. Paradise sometimes wore the face of captivity. Life inside the camps followed a rhythm that was both strange and strangely reassuring. To step past the wire meant surrendering one's freedom, but once inside, a woman found herself caught up in a world that resembled order more than oppression. The barracks were long wooden huts, drafty in winter, stifling in summer, but still better than the shattered shells of apartments many had left behind. Straw mattresses lined the walls, and stoves burned steadily with coal. Compared to sleeping in cellars while bombs tore cities apart, the simplicity of these quarters felt almost indulgent. Each day began with a whistle. Guards moved down the rows, calling roll, rifles slung more for show than menace. The women rose, bleary-eyed, and filed toward the mess hall, where the smell of coffee, real coffee, hung thick in the air. For Anna, who had grown used to a bitter substitute brewed from roasted barley, that aroma alone was enough to make her chest ache. Bread was handed out by the loaf, not the crumb. Butter appeared in soft yellow slabs. On some mornings, there were even eggs, fried on wide iron pans until their edges crisped. It was impossible not to remember the hunger outside the wire, and yet inside, each bite filled more than the stomach. It filled a silence of fear that had gnawed at them for years. Liesel, who had never set foot in America but now lived under its care, discovered peanut butter for the first time. She spread it across her bread with cautious fingers, sniffed at it, and then took a hesitant bite. She grimaced, then laughed, the sticky paste clinging to her tongue. "How can they eat this?" she said, to no one in particular. But the laughter spread down the table, a moment of absurdity that lifted spirits. Soon, even she admitted it was better than nothing. Food became a language of its own, strange, foreign, but mercifully abundant. Work filled the daylight hours. The U.S. military, following the rules of the Geneva Convention, assigned prisoners to tasks that both maintained the camp and aided local communities. Some women peeled potatoes in the kitchens, their fingers quick and sure after years of scarcity had taught them not to waste a scrap. Others sorted laundry, mended uniforms, or staffed the infirmaries, where German orderlies tended to the sick under American doctors. Out in the fields beyond the camp, groups were marched to help with harvests, filling baskets with apples or cutting sheaves of wheat. Payment came not in coins, but in credits redeemable for small luxuries. Soap, combs, sometimes even cigarettes. For women who had bartered family heirlooms for food only months before, The stability of such work felt like a return to dignity. And then there was leisure, an unthinkable word in war-torn Europe, yet alive behind the fences. Camp newsletters were written and circulated, sometimes cheeky, sometimes earnest. Plays were staged with costumes pieced together from rags. A makeshift orchestra performed Beethoven with instruments donated by the Red Cross. On Sundays, guards occasionally allowed music to drift through loudspeakers, and if one stood close enough to the fence, the faint thrum of jazz might be heard, strange, exotic, and intoxicating to German ears. It was during one such evening that Anna first saw the Americans dance. A phonograph crackled to life in the recreation hall, and the guards, off-duty, moved with an ease and rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Some prisoners watched with folded arms, wary, but others were drawn into the music's pull. Liesel laughed at the sight, whispering, "We had marches, not this." Yet soon, toes tapped and hips swayed, until the line between captor and captive blurred, if only for a song. Still, beneath the surface of this order lay an unease that could not be banished. To feel safe in the hands of the enemy was disorienting enough. To enjoy it carried guilt sharper than hunger. Anna wrestled with this often at night, lying awake on her straw mattress, hearing the steady breathing of others in the dark. She thought of her mother, still in Cologne, standing in a bread line that stretched for blocks. Was it betrayal to eat until she was full while her family starved? Was it weakness to find comfort in the enemy's care? These questions festered quietly, and no answer seemed free of shame. Some women sought to resolve this conflict through learning. The Americans, perhaps eager to showcase their values, organized classes, English lessons, basic mathematics, even lectures on democracy. Anna enrolled eagerly, scribbling words in a notebook until her hand cramped. To her, language felt like a bridge across the chasm of enmity, though she knew not everyone approved. Liesel teased her, "Next you'll be pledging loyalty to their president." But beneath the jests lay a deeper current, an acknowledgement that something was shifting in their hearts. Relationships within the camp added further complexity. The women formed bonds quickly, clinging to each other for warmth and familiarity. Yet even among them, lines were drawn. Some viewed the guards with suspicion, insisting the comfort was temporary and deceptive. Others, especially the younger women, could not help but notice the kindness of certain soldiers, the way they turned a blind eye to small infractions or shared contraband chocolates. Rumors of romances whispered through the barracks. A guard caught speaking too long to a prisoner was teased by his fellows. A woman seen blushing at roll call was nudged by her bunkmates. The war had stripped lives to their barest essentials, but within the fences, humanity stubbornly crept back in. What struck many most was the absence of fear. Outside, German women lived with the constant threat of violence, robbery, assault, revenge. In the Soviet zone especially, stories of brutality spread like wildfire, chilling those who heard them. Inside the American camps, however, order reigned. Rules were firm, but predictable. For Liesel, this predictability was its own kind of liberation. "I slept without clutching a knife," she admitted once, "because for the first time I knew no one would come in the night." The irony was hard to ignore. What had begun as punishment now felt like sanctuary, and though no one said it too loudly, some dreaded the day of release. For freedom meant returning to ruins, to hunger, to the gnawing uncertainty of survival. Captivity, in its paradox, had become a shield against the chaos of peace. By the autumn of 1945, even American officers remarked on the odd tranquility of their prisoners. Escape attempts were rare to the point of absurdity. "They do not flee," one report noted, "because there is nowhere better to run to." The guards joked about it among themselves, but beneath the humor lay a discomfort. What did it mean when prison was preferable to liberty? For Anna and Liesel, the days blended into weeks, each one layered with small discoveries and quiet reckonings. They learned new words, tasted new foods, and built fragile routines that soothed their battered spirits. Yet with every passing season, the looming question grew heavier. What would happen when the gates finally opened? The women could not stay forever. Papers would be signed, transfers arranged, and one day they would be marched back to freedom's doorstep. But freedom, in 1945 Germany, was a broken promise. And so, as winter crept across the camp and frost glistened on the barbed wire, they clung to the warmth inside, knowing that paradise, however improbable, was slipping through their fingers. Would they look back on this place with shame or with longing? No one could say. But already, a quiet truth pulsed through the camp, undeniable and unsettling. Captivity had given them back their humanity, and the thought of losing it was almost unbearable. Anna's story deepened as the months passed, her transformation etched quietly in the folds of daily life. At first, she had been cautious, clutching her tin plate as if someone might snatch it away, speaking little, and keeping her eyes lowered. But the camp had a way of reshaping its inhabitants, drawing out parts of them that war had buried. She began to study English with a determination that surprised even herself. Every evening, she traced words onto scraps of paper with a dull pencil, repeating them under her breath. The guards noticed her diligence, and one, a tall farm boy from Iowa named Private Miller, sometimes corrected her pronunciation. Their exchanges were brief, formal, but in the quietness of those lessons she discovered something she had not felt in years: possibility. Liesel, meanwhile, carried a different kind of burden. She had lost her husband in the bombings of Hamburg, and though she never spoke of him directly, her silence was heavy enough to be felt. She threw herself into work at the infirmary, tending to cuts and fevers with a competence born of necessity. The Americans respected her skill, often relying on her judgment more than regulations required. It was in the infirmary that she began to soften, her grief finding a channel in the care she gave others. To the younger women, she became a figure of steadiness, the one who offered comfort when memories of home threatened to undo them. There were moments, however, when even she could not suppress the strangeness of their existence. One evening, as Anna practiced her English, Liesel sat beside her and shook her head. "It's absurd, isn't it? That we sit here learning their language, laughing at their jokes, while our country lies in ashes." She did not say it with bitterness, but with the weariness of someone caught between two worlds. Anna only nodded, for she too felt the pull of divided loyalties. What none of them could deny was that the camp was shaping them, forcing them to confront truths that would have been unthinkable before the surrender. The Americans were no longer faceless enemies. They were men with quirks and tempers, men who missed their homes, who wrote letters back to farms and towns across the ocean. The more the women saw them as human, the more impossible it became to cling to old hatreds. Romances began to bloom, cautiously, in the spaces where rules bent. Liesel disapproved, though she did not speak against them openly. She believed it was dangerous to grow attached, that hearts would break when the gates finally opened. But Anna was not so guarded. Her exchanges with Private Miller grew warmer, and though nothing improper passed between them, she found herself smiling at the sound of his voice, eager for the next lesson. At night, she wondered what it might mean to step into a world shaped not by bombs but by choices. Not all women welcomed such changes. Some clung tightly to the memory of a Germany that had promised them greatness, resenting the comfort they received from the hands of the enemy. They whispered among themselves that the Americans were softening them, weakening their resolve. A few even refused to eat certain foods, insisting it was a form of resistance. Yet these acts of defiance faded against the steady hum of life that carried on around them. Hunger, it seemed, had a way of eroding ideology. The camp itself reflected this transformation. The barracks, once grim with suspicion, now buzzed with energy. Murals appeared on the walls, sunsets, rivers, even portraits of imagined futures. Plays were rehearsed with laughter that spilled out into the yards. An orchestra formed from battered instruments, their notes shaky but earnest. It was as though the women, in captivity, were reclaiming the fragments of humanity that war had tried to strip away. For Liesel, the change came one night in the infirmary, when a guard arrived with a cut on his hand. He had been careless with a tool, and though the wound was minor, he grimaced like a child. She cleaned and wrapped it with efficient care, then looked up to see his face softening with gratitude. In that moment, she felt a shift, small but undeniable. She was no longer merely a prisoner tending to her captor. She was a nurse, and he was simply a man who hurt. For the first time in years, she felt the quiet dignity of being useful beyond survival. The irony was not lost on them. Captivity had given them back what war had stolen: purpose, connection, even hope. But this gift carried a weight. Each passing week brought whispers of release. Lists were drawn up, names called, and women led beyond the gates. Those who left often wrote back, their letters carrying a tone of despair. "The city is rubble," one wrote. I would return to the camp if they allowed it. Such words spread uneasily among those who remained. How could freedom be more terrifying than imprisonment? Anna thought often of that question as she sat with her notebook, words forming slowly in a language not her own. She imagined herself walking out of the gate, her mother's arms waiting, yet the image rang hollow. What future lay in ruins? And what shame would come from confessing that she preferred the company of her captors to the ghosts of her homeland? Liesel too struggled, though she buried it beneath her work. She feared the day the infirmary would no longer need her hands, when she would be cast back into a world that had no place for widows and no patience for grief. She had found, in this strange prison, a fragile sense of belonging. To lose it was to lose the only ground she had left. By winter, the tension was plain. The camp had ceased to feel like a stopgap and instead became a world unto itself, with rhythms, relationships, and fragile comforts that none dared trust but all secretly cherished. Yet every guard's watch, every paper signed in distant offices, reminded them that it could not last. The gates would open, whether they wished it or not. And so the women lived in a paradox, their hearts torn between longing for home and dread of it, caught between loyalty to a past that had crumbled and a future that seemed to speak in a foreign tongue. Each day brought laughter and guilt in equal measure. Each night ended with the same unspoken question. When freedom came, would they be strong enough to face it, or would they forever dream of the days when captivity, against all reason, had felt like salvation? By the winter of 1946, the camp's routines, once so strange, then strangely comforting, had begun to fray under the weight of change. Notices appeared on bulletin boards, names scrawled in ink, announcing transfers and releases. The word stirred both relief and dread, for with freedom came the return to a world still broken, still hungry, and for some, still merciless. The women whispered among themselves at night, voices carrying through the thin Baroque walls. Who would be called next? And what waited beyond the wire? Anna studied her name the first time it appeared, her chest tightening. Release meant Cologne, meant her mother, meant rubble and scarcity and the ghosts of her childhood streets. She should have felt joy. Instead, her heart twisted. She thought of Private Miller, of the hesitant laughter they shared over clumsy English lessons, of the notebook she filled with words that no longer felt foreign but alive. He had said once, quietly, "You'll do well out there. You're tougher than you know." Yet the way his eyes lingered betrayed a truth neither dared voice. When the gates opened, there would be no farewell beyond a nod, no promises that could bridge an ocean. Liesel confronted her notice with different eyes. Her husband gone, her home leveled, she had little to return to but memories she could no longer bear. Yet she carried herself with dignity, refusing to let the fear show. "It is time," she told Anna, though her voice wavered. "We cannot live forever behind fences." She had found purpose in the infirmary, in bandaging wounds and steadying trembling hands, but even that fragile sanctuary could not last. She knew the camp had kept her grief at bay, and outside it would come rushing back. Still, she clung to a sense of duty. To leave was to face what remained, however little. On the morning of their departure, the women lined up by the gates, each clutching a small bundle of belongings: blankets, notebooks, a bar of soap, a tin of cigarettes, tokens of a captivity that had given them more stability than freedom had ever promised. The guards called names, voices crisp in the cold air. Some women wept openly, others stood rigid, their faces masks of resolve. Anna's knees shook as she stepped forward, her gaze darting toward the guardhouse. Miller was there, his cap low, his expression unreadable. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. He did not speak, but the faintest nod passed between them, and in that silent gesture, Anna carried a memory she knew would outlast the hunger to come. Beyond the gates, the world waited with brutal honesty. Roads churned to mud by carts and boots, houses burned to hollow shells, queues of civilians clutching ration cards in numb silence. The promises of peace were slow in coming. In many towns, women returned to lines longer than the days themselves, to rations measured in crumbs, to fear that still hung heavy in the air. One Red Cross report recorded that German civilians in 1946 consumed fewer calories than the prisoners they envied. Freedom, stripped of illusion, was a harsher captivity. Anna and Liesel walked through those ruins together, their breath clouding in the winter air. Anna's mother embraced her with tears, her frame thin, her eyes weary, yet alive. That reunion brought a surge of joy, but it was tempered by the gnawing realization that survival outside the fence demanded more grit than captivity ever had. Bread was scarce, walls leaked, nights were cold. Anna thought often of the barracks, of the steady meals and the strange safety of barbed wire. She did not speak it aloud, but the thought haunted her. Prison had felt like a place to grow, while freedom felt like a place to endure. For Liesel, the return was lonelier still. With no family to welcome her, she took shelter with distant relatives, working where she could, patching clothes, cleaning floors. Yet she carried the memory of the infirmary within her, the dignity of usefulness, and in quiet moments, she longed for the order of the camp. There, she had been more than a widow. She had been needed. Outside, she was just another shadow in the ruins. And yet, even in this bleakness, transformations endured. Anna's English notebook became her lifeline. She practiced words by candlelight, teaching her mother phrases, imagining a future beyond the rubble. When Marshall Plan shipments began arriving in 1948, flour, milk, canned goods, she was among the first to interpret the labels, her lessons in captivity now serving survival in freedom. Her bond with Miller remained a ghost, but the language he nurtured in her became a bridge to hope. Liesel found her own transformation slower, but no less profound. She began assisting at a makeshift clinic in her village, her skill with bandages and fevers once again in demand. Each time she steadied a hand or soothed a child's cough, she remembered the strange gift captivity had given her, the reminder that even in ruins, humanity could be restored one act at a time. Historians would later write of the paradox. Red Cross files noted the irony. German women in U.S. custody often lived better than their families outside. Statistics confirmed it. But for Anna and Liesel, the numbers were only shadows of lived truth. The camp had been a crucible, a place where enmity blurred into humanity, where prison had whispered promises freedom could not yet keep. Years later, Anna would admit in a letter, "I feared leaving more than I ever feared being captured." And Liesel, older, grayer, still repeated to anyone who asked, "Behind the wire, I learned to live again. Outside, I had to learn to survive." The story of those women was not one of triumph or despair alone, but of contradiction, the kind history rarely knows how to reconcile. Captivity gave them shelter, food, and the faint spark of new beginnings. Freedom returned them to ruins, yet demanded they use what they had found inside the fences. In that tension lay the truth of their war's end. And so the barbed wire faded behind them, but never left their memory. To the world, they were released. To themselves, they were cast into a freedom that felt like exile from the one place where, for a fleeting moment, they had tasted safety. For Anna, for Liesel, for countless women whose names history barely recalls, the question lingered long after the gates closed. Was it prison they had left behind, or the closest thing to paradise they would ever know?